Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. October in Colorado gets dark earlier than people expect, and by 4:30 that Thursday afternoon, shadows were already stretching across our kitchen floor when I got home from school. I was 15, a sophomore at Ridgeview High, and had just started getting rides home with my friend Jenna's older brother since soccer practice had moved to mornings. My dad worked as an engineer at a tech firm downtown, usually getting home around 6:30, and my mom managed a dental office 40 minutes away, which meant she rarely made it back before 7. We lived in one of those newer developments off Highway 6, where every house had the same basic floor plan, but different colored siding. Ours was pale gray with white trim. The neighborhood was quiet on weekdays, mostly families with young kids who were still at daycare, or older folks who kept to themselves. That afternoon felt completely ordinary. I'd grabbed the mail from the box, dumped my backpack by the stairs, and was heating up leftover pizza in the microwave when I heard the back door creak open. The guy my parents had hired for odd jobs around the house was named Brett, and he'd been coming by for about 6 months whenever something needed fixing. He was maybe 38 or 40, hard to tell exactly, with premature gray streaking through his brown hair and rough hands that always had grease or paint under the fingernails. He wore the same faded blue coveralls every time I saw him, with his name stitched in red thread on the front pocket, though the letters were coming loose at the edges. My mom found him through a neighborhood Facebook group when our fence started falling apart after a bad storm. He charged half what the professional contractors wanted and didn't mind being paid in cash. Brett had fixed the fence, retiled the downstairs bathroom, cleaned the gutters, and just last Saturday had finished installing heavy-duty shelving units in our garage. My dad had paid him that same day. I remembered because Brett had counted the bills twice at our kitchen table while I was doing homework, licking his thumb between each 20. "Mom!" I called out, even though her car wasn't in the driveway, and she never came home this early anyway. The microwave beeped behind me, but I didn't move to get the pizza. Our back door opened directly into a small mudroom that connected to the kitchen, and from where I stood by the counter I could see straight through to whoever was coming in. Brett appeared in the doorway, still wearing those same coveralls, but something about him seemed different. Maybe it was the way he didn't knock first or call out to announce himself like he usually did. He just stood there for a moment, his bulk filling the frame before stepping inside and closing the door behind him. The automatic porch light hadn't turned on yet, so his face was partially shadowed, but I could see he was carrying his old red toolbox, the one with the broken latch that he had to hold closed with his hand. "Hey there, kiddo," he said, using that nickname I'd always hated but never corrected him about. His voice sounded thicker than usual, like he'd been sleeping or maybe drinking, though it was hard to tell. "Didn't mean to startle you. Left my good drill in the garage on Saturday, the DeWalt one. Your folks said I could swing by and grab it whenever." That might have been true, except my parents were meticulous about communication, and they always texted me if someone was stopping by when I'd be home alone. I pulled out my phone to check, but there were no messages from either of them. Brett was already walking through the kitchen toward the door that led to the garage, his work boots leaving faint dirt prints on my mom's clean floor. The way he moved seemed too casual, too comfortable, like he belonged here. I followed him to the garage door, keeping my phone in my hand. "I can get it for you," I offered, trying to sound normal even though my mouth had gone dry. "Just tell me where you left it." Brett turned the doorknob but didn't open the door yet. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, and I noticed a smell coming off him. Not alcohol exactly, but something sharp and chemical, like paint thinner or gasoline. His toolbox made a metallic rattling sound as he adjusted his grip on it. "Nah, I got it. Might be a few other things I left too. Been doing so many jobs lately, hard to keep track of all my tools." He opened the door and flicked on the garage light, but instead of going straight to the shelves he'd installed, he stopped and scanned the space slowly, like he was memorizing it. My dad's mountain bike hung on the wall. My mom's gardening supplies were organized in clear bins, and there were boxes of Christmas decorations stacked in the corner. The garage felt colder than usual, and I realized the side door that led to the backyard was slightly ajar, moving just enough in the breeze to make a soft scraping sound against the frame. Brett must have come in that way, which meant he'd walked around the entire house instead of coming to the front door like a normal person would. "Actually," he said, setting his toolbox down on my dad's workbench with a heavy thud, "might take me a minute to find everything. Had a bunch of drill bits too, specialty ones. Why don't you go back inside where it's warm?" He wasn't even pretending to look for a drill anymore. Instead, he was opening drawers in the workbench, pulling things out and setting them aside like he was taking inventory. My dad kept cash in one of those drawers, in an old Altoids tin. Emergency money, he called it, usually about $200. I watched Brett's hands getting closer to that particular drawer, and that's when I decided to lie. "My dad's on his way home early today," I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "He texted me like 10 minutes ago. Had to leave work for a dentist appointment, so he'll be here any minute." Brett's hands stopped moving. He looked up at me, and for the first time since he'd arrived, he made real eye contact. His eyes were bloodshot with dark circles underneath, and there was a small cut on his left cheek that looked fresh, maybe a day or two old. "That right?" he asked, his tone flat and unreadable. He abandoned the drawer he'd been about to open and picked up his toolbox again, but he didn't move toward the door. Funny, I drove by his office on my way here, saw his truck in the parking lot. My pulse hammered in my ears. How did he know where my dad worked? Had he been watching us, learning our routines? "He's using my mom's car today," I said quickly. "His truck needed an oil change." Brett made a humming sound, that same tuneless humming he always did while working, except now it sounded menacing in the cold garage. He walked past me back into the house, and I had no choice but to follow. But instead of heading toward the back door where he'd entered, he turned left into our living room. "Just remembered," he said, running his free hand along the back of our couch. "I might have left some screws on the mantel when I was checking that loose panel above your fireplace last month." There had never been any loose panel. He'd never worked in our living room. I stayed in the doorway between the kitchen and living room, calculating distances. The front door was too far. He'd catch me before I could unlock it. The back door was closer, but he was between me and it now. My phone was still in my hand, but calling 911 would take too long. And what would I even say? That our handyman was looking for his tools. He picked up a family photo from the mantel, the one from our vacation to Yellowstone last summer, and studied it carefully. "Nice picture," he said. "Your mom looks young here. She's still wearing her hair like that?" The question made bile rise in my throat. The sound of footsteps upstairs made us both freeze. Heavy footsteps, deliberate and slow, moving from one room to another directly above us. Brett's eyes flicked to the ceiling, then back to me. "Thought you said you were alone," he said quietly, setting the photo down with exaggerated care. My mind raced. I knew nobody was upstairs. I'd been home for 20 minutes and would have heard someone. But the footsteps continued, and then we heard a door slam hard enough to rattle the pictures on the wall. Brett's whole demeanor changed. His shoulders tensed and he gripped his toolbox tighter, the knuckles on his hand going white. "Who's up there?" he demanded, taking a step toward me. I backed into the kitchen, my hip hitting the counter. "I don't know," I said truthfully, and my confusion must have been genuine enough because he seemed to believe me. Another door slammed upstairs, then another, like someone was going room to room, and suddenly I understood. My neighbor, Mrs. Zhao, had a key to our house for emergencies. She was 73, sharp as a tack, and had probably seen Brett's unfamiliar vehicle in our driveway. "I should go," Brett said abruptly, but he didn't move toward either exit. Instead, he stood perfectly still, listening to the footsteps that were now heading toward the stairs. The person up there was making as much noise as possible, and I heard what sounded like furniture being dragged across the floor. Brett's breathing had gotten heavier, and sweat was beading on his forehead despite the cool October air. "Tell your parents I'll come back another time for my drill," he said, already backing toward the mudroom. "When they're home." The footsteps started down the stairs, slow, heavy, deliberate. Each step creaked loudly, which was strange because our stairs never creaked. Brett didn't wait to see who it was. He turned and walked quickly through the kitchen, his toolbox banging against his leg. I heard the back door open and close and then the sound of feet running across our backyard. I stayed pressed against the kitchen counter, afraid to move, as the footsteps reached the bottom of the stairs. Mrs. Zhao appeared in the doorway, holding my old aluminum baseball bat from middle school in one hand and her phone in the other. Her usually neat silver hair was disheveled and she was breathing hard from rushing over. "I saw him creeping around the side of your house," she said, her voice shaky but determined. "Called the police already. They're on their way." She'd been watching from her kitchen window while making her afternoon tea. Saw Brett trying the side gate first, then walking around to the back. What really alarmed her was that she'd seen him sitting in his van at the end of our street for almost an hour before he approached the house, just watching. She'd found the spare key my mom had given her and came in through the front door while I was in the garage with Brett, then made all that noise on purpose. "I figured if he thought someone else was here, someone bigger and scarier than you or me, he might leave," she explained, still gripping the bat. We waited together in the kitchen until the police arrived, and I called my parents while Mrs. Zhao gave her statement to the officers. They found Brett's van abandoned 2 streets over with the engine still running. Inside, the police discovered he'd been recently evicted from his apartment, had been living in the van for weeks, and had a notebook with information about several families he'd worked for, their schedules, when kids were home alone, where they kept spare keys, even details about valuable items in their homes. Our address had multiple pages of notes, including the fact that I was usually alone from 3:45 to 6:30 on weekdays. The DeWalt drill he claimed to have left was sitting right there in his van, along with several other tools that he'd probably stolen from other clients. He was arrested 3 days later trying to break into another house 2 towns over, one where he'd installed a ceiling fan the previous month. The family's teenage son was homesick from school, but Brett hadn't known about the change in routine. We never found out what he'd planned to do that Thursday afternoon at our house, and honestly, I'm grateful for that. My parents installed a security system the next week, changed all the locks, and we never hired anyone from Facebook groups again. Mrs. Zhao still watches our house when I'm home alone, and I keep her number on speed dial. Sometimes I still hear phantom footsteps upstairs when I'm by myself, but now I know it's just the old house settling, not someone coming to help me. Living alone in a duplex in suburban Milwaukee wasn't supposed to be permanent. I'd moved there in August 2018 after my divorce, just needing something cheap and quiet while I figured out my next move. The place was nothing special. Beige walls, outdated kitchen, one of those sliding glass doors to a tiny backyard that I never used. I was working nights at a warehouse back then, which meant I slept during the day and spent most evenings just killing time before my shift. The neighborhood was boring in the best way possible. Families with kids, retired couples who kept their lawns perfect, everyone minded their own business. That Tuesday in early September started like any other day off. I'd woken up around 3 p.m., made some coffee, and realized I needed to grab a few things from the 7-Eleven about 4 blocks away. The convenience store run should have taken 10 minutes, tops. I parked in the nearly empty lot and was walking toward the entrance when these 2 guys came out. The first one was tall and skinny, maybe early 30s, wearing a faded Packers jersey that hung loose on his frame. His buddy was shorter, stockier, had this weird bleached patch in his otherwise dark hair, like he'd started dyeing it and given up halfway through. They were carrying cases of beer and heading to a beat-up Chevy Tahoe. As I passed them, the tall one bumped into me, hard enough that I stumbled. When I turned around, he was grinning at me with these yellowed teeth and said something like, "Watch where you're going, princess." His friend laughed, this high-pitched giggle that didn't match his build at all. I just kept walking, but I could feel them staring at me. Inside the store, I could see them through the window, still standing by their truck, passing a cigarette back and forth and looking in my direction. I grabbed what I needed: milk, bread, some frozen dinners, trying to shake off the weird encounter. The cashier, this kid named Brandon who I'd seen there 100 times, must have noticed something was up because he asked if everything was all right. I told him it was nothing, just some drunk idiots in the parking lot. But when I went to leave, their Tahoe was still there, engine running now, parked right next to my Ford Ranger. The tall guy was in the driver's seat, window down, that same stupid grin on his face. As I loaded my stuff into my truck, he leaned out and said, "Nice truck, princess. Bet you got a nice place too." The way he said it made my skin prickle. His friend was recording me with his phone, holding it up obviously, wanting me to see. I didn't respond, just got in my truck and backed out carefully, watching them in my rearview mirror the whole time. They followed me for about 2 blocks before turning off onto a side street. I took a longer route home just to be safe, circling through the neighborhood twice before pulling into my driveway. The rest of the afternoon was normal. I made dinner, did some laundry, called my brother in Phoenix to talk about nothing important. By the time it got dark around 7:30, I'd almost forgotten about those guys. I settled into my recliner to watch the Brewers game, had a couple beers, was actually starting to relax. My living room faces the front of the house with these thick blinds I usually kept closed at night. The TV was the only light on, casting those flickering shadows you get during night games. Around 10:45, bottom of the 8th inning, I heard a car door slam somewhere close. Not unusual. My neighbor Paul worked odd hours too. But then I heard footsteps on my driveway. Slow, deliberate footsteps on the gravel, like someone trying to be quiet but not quite managing it. I muted the TV and sat perfectly still, listening. The footsteps stopped right outside my front window. My heart was hammering so hard I could hear it in my ears. Through a tiny gap in the blinds, I could see 2 figures on my driveway. The street light at the end of my driveway lit them up just enough. It was them, the tall one and his buddy with the bleached patch. They were both wearing dark gloves now, the rubber kind you'd wear to wash dishes. The tall one was looking at my front door while the shorter one was scanning the windows. I slid out of my recliner as quietly as I could, staying low, and grabbed my phone from the coffee table. My first instinct was to call 911, but I hesitated. What if they heard me talking? What if they ran before the cops arrived and came back another night when I wasn't expecting them? As I crouched there behind my couch, I heard the doorknob rattle. They were trying the lock. The sound of metal scratching against metal came next. They were picking the lock or trying to jimmy it somehow. I crawled on my hands and knees to the hallway, staying out of sight from the windows. My bedroom was at the back of the house, and I kept my grandfather's old Remington 870 in the closet. I'd never pointed it at anyone before, never even thought I'd have to. As I grabbed it and checked that it was loaded, I heard them talking outside, their voices muffled but clear enough. The short one was saying something about checking the back door. That's when real panic set in. The sliding glass door in my kitchen had a flimsy lock that barely worked. If they went around back, they'd be inside in seconds. I positioned myself at the corner of the hallway, where I could see both the front door and the kitchen. The gun felt heavy and cold in my sweaty hands. Through the kitchen, I could see a flashlight beam sweeping across my backyard. I heard the sliding door handle jiggle, then that distinctive sound of someone trying to force it up and over the track. My mouth went completely dry. I pumped the shotgun once. That unmistakable cha-chunk sound echoed through the quiet house. Everything stopped. The flashlight beam froze, pointing at my kitchen floor through the glass. For maybe 10 seconds, nobody moved. Then I heard rapid footsteps running along the side of my house back toward the front. I rushed to the living room window and peeked out just in time to see them sprinting to their Tahoe. The tall one looked back at my house once before jumping in. They peeled out so fast they left rubber marks on the street that were still there weeks later. I stood there for probably 5 minutes, gun still raised, waiting to make sure they were really gone. My whole body was shaking with adrenaline. When I finally felt safe enough to move, I called 911 and turned on every light in the house. The cops showed up about 15 minutes later. Two officers who looked barely older than the cashier at 7-Eleven. They found pry marks on my front door and footprints all around my property. The back door showed clear signs someone had tried to force it. One officer, Officer Nowak, took pictures while his partner asked me questions. I told them about the encounter at the store, described the men, even mentioned the filming. Nowak said they'd check if the 7-Eleven had security footage. They stayed for about an hour, told me to consider getting better locks, maybe a security system. After they left, I dragged my recliner into my bedroom and sat there until sunrise with the shotgun across my lap. I called in sick to work. There was no way I was leaving the house that night. Around 6 a.m., I finally dozed off for a couple hours. When I woke up, I immediately went online and ordered new deadbolts, a security camera system, and motion sensor lights. The next few days were rough. I'd jump at every little sound, check the locks constantly, look out the windows every few minutes. I installed the new deadbolts myself, spent a whole Saturday setting up the cameras and lights. Paul from next door saw me up on a ladder and came over to help. When I told him what happened, he mentioned he'd seen a Tahoe driving slowly past our houses a few times that week before the attempted break-in. Said he didn't think much of it at the time, figured someone was lost. That detail made me sick to my stomach. They'd been planning this, watching my routine, knowing when I'd be home alone. I started parking my truck in different spots, varying when I left for work, being hyper-aware of any vehicle that seemed to be following me. The paranoia was exhausting. I'd check the camera feeds obsessively on my phone during work breaks, sometimes calling in favors with coworkers to drive by my house during their lunch breaks, just to make sure everything looked normal. About 2 weeks later, Officer Nowak called with an update. They'd arrested both men after they tried to break into another house 3 neighborhoods over. The homeowner there had a German Shepherd that went absolutely ballistic when they tried the back door, woke up the whole family. The husband held them at gunpoint until police arrived. Turns out they had a whole operation going. They'd stake out houses, figure out when people were alone, then break in looking for electronics, cash, prescription drugs. The tall one was named Robert Henley, had a record going back years for burglary and assault. His partner was Vincent Russo, mostly petty theft before this. They found videos on Russo's phone of at least 12 different houses, including mine. The prosecutor said I'd probably have to testify if it went to trial, but both ended up taking plea deals. Henley got 3 years, Russo got 18 months. Even with them locked up, it took months before I could sleep properly again. I'd still wake up at every creak, every car door, every dog bark in the neighborhood. I ended up getting a dog myself, a rescue pit bull mix named Brutus who barks at everything and sleeps at the foot of my bed. Funny thing is, he's actually a total softie, scared of the vacuum cleaner and loves belly rubs, but he makes me feel safer. I stayed in that duplex for another year before finding a better place, a second-floor apartment with only one entrance and a doorman. Some people think I overreacted, that I should have just called the cops right away that night instead of grabbing the gun. Maybe they're right. But when you're alone in your house and you hear someone trying to break in, someone you know has been watching you planning this, your brain doesn't exactly work through all the rational options. You just react. That sound of the shotgun pumping probably saved me from whatever they had planned, and I don't regret it for a second. I still see that Tahoe sometimes in my dreams, still hear those footsteps on gravel when I'm half asleep. The security system at my new place is probably overkill. Cameras, smart locks, motion sensors, the works. But it helps me sleep. I ran into Brandon from the 7-Eleven last month at a Bucks game. He remembered that day, said those 2 guys had been hanging around the store for hours before I showed up, already drunk and looking for trouble. He felt bad he didn't warn me somehow. I told him it wasn't his fault. Nobody could have predicted they'd follow me home and try to break in. But here's the thing that still gets me. If I hadn't gone to the store that specific afternoon, if I'd gone an hour earlier or later, none of this would have happened. They picked me randomly, just wrong place, wrong time. That's what keeps me up sometimes. How quick your whole sense of safety can disappear just because you needed milk and bread on a Tuesday afternoon. Most people don't know what real fear feels like until they're 16 and alone, in a house that suddenly feels too big, too quiet, too exposed. It was a Saturday afternoon in early June 2016, one of those lazy summer days where the heat makes everything move in slow motion. My parents had driven up to Boston for their college reunion weekend, leaving me in charge of our 2-story colonial in a quiet Connecticut suburb. I was sprawled on the living room couch, halfway through a Netflix binge and a family-size bag of Doritos, feeling pretty good about having the whole place to myself. The air conditioning hummed steadily, drowning out most of the neighborhood sounds, and I remember thinking how perfect everything was. No annoying little brother, no parents asking about homework, just me and 6 more episodes of whatever show I was obsessed with that summer. Around 4:30, I heard knocking at the front door. Not the doorbell, which was weird because everyone who came to our house used the doorbell. The knocking had this specific rhythm to it: 3 quick taps, pause, 2 more taps, like someone trying to be polite but persistent. Then I heard it. "Hey kiddo, it's Uncle Steve. Can you let me in?" I locked myself out of my car and my phone's dead. The voice was muffled through the heavy oak door, but it sounded exactly like him. That slight Boston accent he never quite lost, the way he stretched out the word kiddo like he always did. Uncle Steve lived about 20 minutes away and dropped by all the time, usually unannounced, always bringing those butterscotch candies I pretended not to like anymore but secretly still loved. My first instinct was to jump up and unlock the door, but something made me hesitate. Mom had mentioned something that morning about Uncle Steve being in Vermont for the week, visiting his girlfriend's family at their cabin. I walked slowly to the front door, my bare feet silent on the hardwood floor, and peered through the peephole. The fisheye lens distorted everything, but I could see a figure standing there wearing a baseball cap pulled low and what looked like Uncle Steve's favorite Navy windbreaker, the one with the faded Red Sox logo on the chest. The thing is, the porch light wasn't on, and the late afternoon sun was hitting at just the wrong angle, casting shadows across his face. "Come on, sweetheart," the voice continued, and I felt my chest tighten. Uncle Steve never called me sweetheart. It was always kiddo or squirt when he was being extra annoying, but never sweetheart. "I know you're in there. I saw your car in the driveway." That made me pause even more because I didn't have a car. I'd just gotten my permit 3 weeks ago and wasn't allowed to drive alone yet. The figure shifted, and for just a second, I caught a glimpse of his hand reaching up to adjust the cap, and his fingers looked wrong somehow. Too thick, too long, with these yellowish nails that Uncle Steve definitely didn't have. "Listen, I really need to use the bathroom," the voice said, and now it sounded strained, like he was trying too hard to sound casual. "Remember last Thanksgiving when you spilled cranberry sauce all over Grandma Dorothy's tablecloth, and I helped you clean it up before your mom noticed? I didn't tell anyone about that. Come on, just open up for a minute." My whole body went rigid. We did have a cranberry sauce incident last Thanksgiving, but it wasn't Grandma Dorothy's tablecloth. She'd been dead for 3 years. It was Aunt Marie's tablecloth, and Uncle Steve hadn't been there to help because he'd been outside smoking with my dad. Whoever was standing on our porch knew enough about our family to get close, but not enough to get it right. I backed away from the door, my heart hammering so hard I could hear it in my ears, and grabbed my phone from the coffee table. The knocking came again, harder this time, more insistent. "I can hear you moving around in there. Don't be rude to your uncle." My fingers fumbled with the phone as I tried to call my mom, but the call went straight to voicemail. She'd warned me the reunion venue had terrible reception. Dad's phone did the same thing. I thought about calling 911, but what would I even say? There's someone at my door pretending to be my uncle. The knocking turned into pounding now, making the decorative wreath on the door shake. "All right, I didn't want to worry you, but I think I'm having a medical issue here," the voice said, and suddenly it sounded weaker, breathless. My chest, "It's those pills I forgot to take. You remember I have that heart condition, right? The one we found out about after I collapsed at your birthday party?" Another lie. Uncle Steve did have a heart condition, but he found out about it during a routine physical, not at any birthday party. This person had pieces of truth mixed with complete fabrications, like they'd been studying our family from a distance, collecting fragments of our lives. I texted my mom. Someone at door saying they're Uncle Steve, but it's not him. What do I do? The typing bubbles appeared and disappeared several times, but no message came through. The pounding stopped abruptly, and the silence that followed was somehow worse. I crept to the living room window and carefully pulled back the curtain just enough to see the porch. The figure was walking around the side of the house now, heading toward the backyard. Our back door was glass. Those French doors my mom loved because they let in so much light, but they had this flimsy lock that my dad kept saying he'd reinforce but never did. I ran to the kitchen, my socks sliding on the tile, and saw him standing there on the deck, his face pressed against the glass. In the clearer light, I could see him properly for the first time. He had Uncle Steve's general build, that same stocky frame, but his face was all wrong. The features were similar but stretched somehow, like someone had tried to reconstruct Uncle Steve from memory. His eyes were the worst part. They were the right color, that greenish hazel, but they were flat and unblinking, studying me like I was an insect under glass. He smiled when he saw me looking, and his teeth were perfectly white. Too perfect, like dentures or veneers. Nothing like Uncle Steve's coffee-stained, slightly crooked smile. "There you are," he said, his voice still maintaining that Uncle Steve impression, but slipping at the edges like an actor forgetting his accent. His breath fogged up the glass as he spoke, and I noticed he was wearing latex gloves, thin medical ones that made his already strange hands look even more unnatural. "Why don't you just let me in? I promise I won't stay long. I just need to pick up something I left here last week. That watch your dad borrowed, remember?" My dad had never borrowed Uncle Steve's watch. My dad didn't even wear watches. He always said they made his wrist itch. The man's hand moved to the door handle, jiggling it gently at first, then with more force. The lock held, but the whole frame shook, and I knew it wouldn't take much more to break it. I grabbed the biggest knife from the wooden block on the counter, the one Mom used for carving turkey, and held it with both hands, trying to stop them from trembling. "That's not very nice," he said, noticing the knife. His voice dropped the Uncle Steve impression entirely now, becoming something lower, rougher. "I just want to come in and talk." I heard something then that made every muscle in my body lock up, the sound of breaking glass from upstairs. Not loud, not a window smashing, but the careful, deliberate sound of someone cutting through glass, like when my dad had to replace a broken pane in the bathroom window last summer. The man at the back door must have seen my eyes dart upward because he laughed, this soft, pleased chuckle that sounded nothing like Uncle Steve. "That would be my friend," he said conversationally, like we were discussing the weather. "See, I knew you'd be difficult. Kids always are. Your parents really should have taught you better manners." I could hear footsteps above me now, slow and deliberate, moving from what sounded like my parents' bedroom toward the stairs. The man at the door had stopped trying to force it. He just stood there, watching me with those empty eyes, waiting. That's when I realized he wasn't trying to break in anymore. He was keeping me there, making sure I didn't run while his partner came down to get me. The footsteps reached the top of the stairs, and I had maybe seconds to decide what to do. The knife felt useless in my hands. What was I going to do? Fight off two grown men? I thought about the panic button on our alarm system, the one my parents had installed after a string of break-ins in the neighborhood last year. It was on the wall near the garage door, just 15 feet away, but it might as well have been a mile. The man at the back door tapped on the glass with one gloved finger, a steady rhythm like a countdown. "You should probably put that knife down before someone gets hurt," he said, and his voice had this horrible fake concern in it. "Wouldn't want you to have an accident." The footsteps were coming down the stairs now, heavy and unhurried. I could see a shadow moving in the hallway, getting larger. That's when something inside me just snapped into focus. I wasn't going to stand there and wait for whatever they had planned. I spun around and sprinted for the garage door, slamming my palm on the panic button so hard it hurt. The alarm exploded through the house, this piercing shriek that made my ears ring. The man at the back door started pounding on the glass with both fists, his face contorted with rage, no longer bothering with any pretense. I heard the glass crack, spiderwebbing from the impact. The footsteps on the stairs turned into running, and I saw him clearly as he rounded the corner into the kitchen. A tall, thin man in dark clothes with a ski mask pulled up just enough that I could see his mouth, which was moving like he was cursing, but I couldn't hear anything over the alarm. I yanked open the garage door and ran, still clutching the knife, my socks slipping on the smooth concrete. Our neighbor, Mrs. Nowak, was already on her front lawn with her phone out, probably calling 911. She was this tough Polish lady in her 70s who didn't take nonsense from anyone, and when she saw me running out of the garage barefoot and carrying a knife, she didn't ask questions. She just grabbed my arm and pulled me behind her, shouting something I couldn't understand over the alarm. I turned back to see both men standing in my garage just watching us. They didn't chase me. They just stood there for maybe 3 seconds, looking at Mrs. Nowak and her phone, then turned and walked calmly back through my house. The police arrived within 4 minutes. Turned out 3 different neighbors had called 911 when the alarm went off. They found the house empty, but the back door glass was cracked, and there was a perfect circular hole cut in my parents' bathroom window, the edges smooth like it had been done with professional tools. Nothing was taken, which somehow made it worse. The detective who interviewed me, a woman named Ferretti with kind eyes and gray streaks in her black hair, told me I'd done everything right. She said the men had probably been watching our house, knew my parents' car was gone, knew about Uncle Steve being away, maybe from social media, maybe from just observing. They'd gathered enough information to make their story believable, counting on a teenager being too polite or confused to question someone claiming to be family. What really got to me was when she said they'd probably done this before, successfully, to other kids who hadn't noticed the little mistakes, who'd opened the door thinking they were helping a relative. The part that still keeps me up at night, even now, 6 years later, is what they found in our garbage can by the curb. There was a manila folder with printouts, Facebook photos of our family, including recent ones from my mom's page showing Uncle Steve at Easter dinner, notes about our schedules written in neat handwriting, and a list of family members with details about their relationships to us. But the worst thing was a photo of me walking home from school, taken with a long lens from across the street, dated 2 weeks before that Saturday. They'd been planning it for a while, studying us, waiting for the perfect opportunity. The police never caught them. The fingerprints on the folder didn't match anyone in the system, and the partial license plate Mrs. Nowak remembered led nowhere. My parents installed a whole new security system, cameras everywhere, reinforced doors, the works. But I never felt safe there again. We moved to Virginia the next year, and I still check every lock twice before bed. Still pause when someone knocks instead of using the doorbell. And I absolutely never ever open the door without seeing exactly who's there, no matter how familiar their voice sounds. The wallpaper in my apartment was peeling off in long strips, yellowed from decades of cigarette smoke from previous tenants. And every morning I'd wake up to find another piece had fallen during the night. It was February 2022, and I'd been living in that rundown building on the outskirts of Detroit for about 3 months, working nights at a warehouse while trying to save enough money to move somewhere decent. The place was a dump, but at $400 a month it was all I could afford after my divorce left me starting over at 34. Most nights I'd come home around 2 a.m., heat up whatever leftovers I had in the microwave that only worked if you held the door shut with your hand, and pass out on my second-hand couch while some true crime podcast played in the background. The building had 12 units, and mine was on the 3rd floor, right next to apartment 3B, where the Carmichaels lived. At least that's what their mail said when it accidentally got delivered to my box. The Carmichaels moved in about a month after I did, and from day one, I knew they were going to be trouble. The husband, a stocky guy with a neck tattoo of a scorpion that seemed to pulse when he got angry, worked construction and came home most days covered in drywall dust and rage. His wife, a thin woman with bleached hair that had turned a weird orange color at the roots, worked at a gas station and always wore these oversized sunglasses, even at night, even in the hallway. Their fight started small, raised voices that I could hear through the paper-thin walls while I tried to sleep before my shift. But within 2 weeks, it escalated to screaming matches that shook the light fixture in my bedroom, the sound of furniture being thrown, glass breaking, her crying and begging him to stop. I'd lie there with my pillow over my head, counting down the minutes until I had to leave for work, telling myself it wasn't my business, that getting involved would only make my life harder. Everything changed on a Monday night in early March when I heard something different through the wall. Not just yelling or crying, but this wet, meaty sound, like someone tenderizing steak with a hammer, followed by complete silence. The silence was worse than the screaming because at least when she was crying, I knew she was still conscious. I sat up in bed, still in my work uniform because I'd just gotten home 20 minutes earlier, and pressed my ear against the wall. Nothing. Then footsteps, heavy ones pacing back and forth. I could hear him muttering something but couldn't make out the words. About 10 minutes later, I heard their door open and close, then his boots stomping down the hallway toward the stairs. Through my peephole, I watched him leave carrying a rolled-up rug over his shoulder, the end of it dark with what looked like a stain. My mouth went dry as I realized she hadn't made a sound since that horrible thudding noise. I paced my apartment for an hour, going back and forth between my kitchen and living room, which were basically the same room separated by a counter with missing cabinet doors. Part of me wanted to knock on their door, check if she was okay, but I kept remembering the way he'd looked at me the one time we'd crossed paths in the hallway. His eyes were these pale gray things, like dirty ice, and they'd tracked me like a predator sizing up prey. Finally, around 4 a.m., I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my phone, went into my bathroom, the farthest room from their apartment, turned on the shower to mask my voice, and called 911. I told them I'd heard what sounded like domestic violence, that it had gone quiet suddenly, that I was worried someone might be seriously hurt. The dispatcher said they'd send someone to check it out, took my name and apartment number, told me to stay in my unit and wait for the officers to contact me if they needed a statement. The cops showed up about 30 minutes later, and through my peephole I watched 2 officers knock on the Carmichael's door. She answered, alive, thank God, wearing a turtleneck in March and keeping her face turned away from the hallway light. Even from my limited view, I could see her hands trembling as she held the door open just a crack. The officers talked to her for maybe 5 minutes, their voices low and professional, but she kept shaking her head, saying everything was fine, that her husband was at work, that she'd just dropped some dishes and that must have been what I heard. They asked if they could come in and look around, but she said no, that she had to get ready for her shift, and since they didn't have a warrant and she wasn't inviting them in, they left. One of them knocked on my door afterward, and I gave a statement about what I'd heard, but without her cooperation, they said there wasn't much they could do. The officer, a young guy with a mustache that looked like he'd drawn it on with a pencil, handed me his card and told me to call again if I heard anything else concerning. I tried to go to sleep after that, but I kept thinking about the way she'd stood in that doorway, angled so we couldn't see the left side of her face, the way her voice had sounded hollow when she'd insisted everything was fine. Around noon, I woke up to the sound of their door slamming so hard that one of my picture frames fell off the wall and shattered on the floor. Through the wall, I could hear him screaming, calling her a stupid bitch, asking her if she thought she was clever, if she thought he wouldn't find out. Then I heard my name. He was yelling my full name, which he must have gotten from the cops or maybe from our mailboxes downstairs, saying I needed to mind my own fucking business if I knew what was good for me. The walls in that place were so thin that I could hear him punching something. The wall, maybe, or a door, and with each impact, I could feel the vibration through my floor. This went on for 20 minutes before everything went quiet again. But it was that dangerous kind of quiet, like the air before a tornado. I had to leave for work at 5 p.m., and I'll be honest, I was terrified to step out of my apartment. I stood at my door for 5 minutes with my hand on the deadbolt, listening for any sound from the hallway. When I finally got the courage to leave, I practically ran to the stairwell, taking the steps 3 at a time. But nothing happened. Their door stayed closed, the hallway stayed empty, and I made it to my car, a beat-up Ford Focus with a driver's side door that you had to lift while closing, without incident. All through my shift that night, I kept checking my phone, half expecting to see a text from my landlord saying my apartment had been broken into or burned down. But there was nothing. When I got home at 2:30 a.m., the building was dead quiet. I could see light coming from under the Carmichael's door, and I could hear a TV playing, but that was it. I went into my apartment, locked the deadbolt, put a chair against the door for good measure, and tried to convince myself that maybe he just needed to blow off steam, that it was over now. That's when I heard the pounding on my door. Not knocking, pounding, like someone hitting it with the side of their fist. 3 heavy blows that made the chair I'd propped against it jump. Stood there in my living room, still in my work clothes, not moving, not breathing, hoping whoever it was would think I wasn't home. The pounding came again, harder this time, and I heard the wood around my deadbolt crack slightly. Then silence. I crept toward the door, trying not to make the floorboards creak, and looked through the peephole. The hallway was empty, but the light bulb that usually illuminated the area right outside my door had been unscrewed just enough to leave my doorway in shadow. I stood there with my eye pressed to the peephole for probably 10 minutes, waiting for movement, for any sign of who had been there. That's when I noticed it. A white envelope on the floor that had been slid under my door while I was looking through the peephole. I didn't want to pick it up. Every instinct told me to leave it there, to pretend I hadn't seen it, maybe even to call the cops again. But curiosity won out, the way it always does when you know you shouldn't do something. I bent down, grabbed the envelope by its corner like it might explode, and brought it into the kitchen where the light was better. My name was written on the front in block letters with a black Sharpie, the kind of deliberately anonymous writing that made my chest tight with dread. Inside was a single brass key, looked like a house key, well worn with scratches along the teeth, and a folded piece of notebook paper. The paper had those frayed edges where someone had ripped it out in a hurry. When I unfolded it, there were just 11 words written in the same block letters. "We can come in any time. Next time you won't hear us." My legs actually gave out, and I had to sit down on my kitchen floor, right there next to the garbage can that smelled like old Chinese takeout. The key was identical to my apartment key. Not similar, identical. Same brand, same wear pattern on the head where years of use had rubbed away the brass plating. I compared them side by side under the kitchen light, and they were perfect matches, down to a tiny nick on the 3rd tooth that I'd noticed when I first moved in. Someone had made a copy of my key. The only people who should have had access to it were me and my landlord, Mr. Garrison, a 70-year-old man who lived in Florida and only communicated through his property management company. But then I remembered, about 2 weeks earlier, I'd lost my keys at work. They'd fallen out of my jacket pocket somewhere in the warehouse, and I'd spent my entire lunch break looking for them. Eventually found them by the loading dock, figured they'd slipped out when I was moving boxes. Except now I wondered if they'd really been lost, or if someone had taken them, made a copy, and returned them where I'd find them. The thought made me want to vomit. I called in sick to work the next day, something I'd never done before, and spent the morning at Home Depot buying new locks, a door security bar, and one of those doorstop alarms that screams if someone tries to force entry. The guy at the store, a kid with gauged ears and a name tag that said Nathan, helped me pick out a deadbolt that he said would be practically impossible to pick without power tools. I wanted to tell him that picking the lock wasn't my concern anymore, that they had a key, but I just nodded and threw it in my cart along with a motion sensor light for inside my apartment. When I got back to the building around 1 p.m., the Carmichael's door was open, and I could see straight through to their living room. She was sitting on a brown couch with stuffing coming out of the arms, sorting through what looked like mail, while he stood by the window smoking a cigarette even though it was against the lease. We made eye contact for maybe 2 seconds, him, not her, and he gave me this slow nod, like we were acknowledging something between us. His mouth moved like he was about to say something, but then he just took another drag and turned back to the window. I hurried into my apartment and spent the next 3 hours replacing the locks, my drill so loud I'm sure the whole floor could hear it. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in my living room with all the lights on, the security bar wedged under the doorknob, the doorstop alarm activated, and a baseball bat across my lap. A Louisville Slugger I'd bought years ago for a company softball team I never actually joined. Around 3 a.m. I heard footsteps in the hallway, that distinctive heavy boot sound I'd learned to recognize. They stopped right outside my door, no knocking, no pounding, just standing there. I could see the shadow of feet in the gap under the door, perfectly still. This went on for maybe 5 minutes, though it felt like hours, before the footsteps moved away. The next morning I packed everything I could fit in my car, left the furniture because it was all garbage anyway, and drove to my sister's place in Ohio. Didn't even tell the landlord I was leaving, just abandoned the place and figured losing my security deposit was worth it. Before I left, I slid the key they'd given me under their door with my own note that just said keep it. Never went back, never found out what happened to them, and honestly, I don't want to know. Sometimes at night, even now, 2 years later, living in a decent apartment with proper locks and normal neighbors, I still wake up thinking I hear those boots in the hallway. Living alone for the first time hits different when you're 20, and convinced nothing bad can happen to you. I just moved into this cramped studio apartment near campus in early May 2023, one of those old brick buildings from the 50s with radiators that clanged all night, and windows painted shut from decades of careless landlords. The place wasn't much, just 400 square feet with a kitchenette that barely fit a microwave and a bathroom where you could touch both walls at once, but it was mine. That Saturday afternoon I was sitting cross-legged on my second-hand futon, laptop balanced on my knees trying to finish a paper on Victorian literature that was due Monday morning. The building was eerily quiet, which wasn't unusual for weekends when most students went home or partied elsewhere. I actually preferred it that way. The silence helped me focus, and I'd made myself a huge mug of that vanilla chai tea my roommate from freshman year had gotten me hooked on. The knock came around 3:30, 3 solid raps that made me jump and nearly spilled tea all over my keyboard. I wasn't expecting anyone. My friend Claudia was at her parents' place in Pennsylvania for the weekend, and the guy I'd been seeing, Thomas, was working his shift at the campus bookstore until 6. Through the peephole, I saw a man I didn't recognize, probably mid-40s, wearing a navy jumpsuit with what looked like a name patch sewn on the chest. He had this weird posture, standing too close to the door with his shoulder almost pressed against it, like he was trying to hear if anyone was inside. His hair was this unnatural shade of reddish brown, the kind you get from a box dye job gone wrong, slicked back with too much gel that made it look wet even though it was a sunny day. When he knocked again, harder this time, I could see his knuckles were covered in these dark, irregular scabs, like he'd been punching something rough repeatedly. "Maintenance," he called out, his voice muffled but oddly high-pitched for such a stocky guy. "Got a report about a leak coming from your unit. Need to check your kitchen pipes right away." Here's the thing. I'd been living there for 3 weeks already, and the actual maintenance guy, Jorge, was this sweet older gentleman who always wore a gray uniform with the building's logo embroidered on the pocket. Jorge had fixed my toilet the first week I moved in, and he'd specifically told me that maintenance never shows up without calling first, or leaving a notice under the door at least 24 hours in advance. Plus, he'd mentioned he was the only maintenance person for our building, and the 2 adjacent ones, and that he never worked weekends unless it was an absolute emergency, like a burst pipe flooding multiple units. This guy at my door? His jumpsuit had no logo, just that name patch I couldn't quite read through the peephole's fisheye distortion. I called out, keeping the chain lock secured. "I haven't reported any leak, and I haven't gotten any notice about maintenance today." The man shifted his weight, and I heard him breathing heavily, almost panting, like he'd run up the 3 flights of stairs to my floor. "Ma'am, the leak's affecting the apartment below you," he insisted, and now his voice had this strange urgency that made the hair on my arms stand up. "The tenant in 2B called it in an hour ago. Water's dripping through their ceiling tiles. Could cause major damage if we don't fix it now." The thing is, I knew for a fact that 2B had been empty for at least a month. I'd seen the previous tenant, an elderly woman with 3 cats, move out in April, and the super had mentioned they were renovating it before listing it again. The man started rattling the doorknob, not violently but persistently, like he was testing how sturdy the lock was. Then he did something that made every instinct in my body scream danger. He dropped to his knees and through the gap under my door, about 1.5 inches because the building had settled unevenly over the years. I could see his face pressing against the floor, trying to look inside. His eye appeared in that gap, bloodshot and wide, darting back and forth like he was mapping out my apartment. I stepped back reflexively, my bare feet silent on the worn hardwood, and grabbed my phone from the futon. "I'm calling the building manager right now to verify," I announced loudly, hoping he'd give up and leave. Instead, I heard him stand up quickly, his knees popping, and then came this low, guttural laugh that didn't match the high-pitched voice he'd been using before. "No need for that, ma'am, just trying to help," he said, but he didn't move away from the door. I could hear him breathing, these wet, ragged breaths, and then the sound of metal scraping against metal. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat as I dialed 911, but I kept my voice steady and loud enough for him to hear. "Hi, yes. I need police at 4427 Elmwood Avenue. There's a man impersonating maintenance trying to break into my apartment." The scraping stopped immediately. Through the peephole, I watched him step back from the door, his face flushed and sweaty, those scabbed hands clenched into fists. He stared directly at the peephole like he knew I was watching, and his mouth stretched into this unnaturally wide grin that showed too many teeth, some of them brown and rotting at the gums. The 911 operator was asking me questions, but I couldn't look away from that grin. The man reached into his jumpsuit pocket, and for a terrifying second I thought he was going to pull out a weapon. Instead, he produced a folded piece of paper and held it up to the peephole. Written in shaky block letters with what looked like black marker were the words, "I know you're alone." Then he tucked the paper back in his pocket, gave a mock salute with 2 fingers, and walked away down the hallway. But he didn't head toward the stairs or the elevator. I heard him stop at what sounded like the apartment 2 doors down, 3F, where a grad student named Lily lived by herself. The same 3 knocks echoed through the hallway, the same high-pitched voice. "Maintenance, got a report about a leak." My whole body went cold as I heard Lily's door chain rattle, heard her young voice say, "Oh, sure, just give me a second to put something on." I screamed through my door, "Lily, don't open it! He's not maintenance! I've called the police!" There was a pause. Then I heard Lily's door slam shut and the deadbolt turn. The man in the hallway let out this frustrated growl, definitely in his real voice now. Deep and gravelly, nothing like the maintenance worker act he'd been putting on. He pounded on Lily's door 3 times with what sounded like the side of his fist, making the whole hallway echo. Then I heard his heavy footsteps moving back toward my apartment. He stopped right outside my door again, and I could hear him muttering something under his breath, these incomprehensible words that sounded like he was having an argument with himself. The 911 operator was telling me units were on the way, maybe 5 minutes out, but 5 minutes feels like 5 hours when there's just a piece of wood between you and someone who clearly isn't right in the head. Then I heard another sound that made my knees weak, keys jingling. Not just a few keys, but what sounded like dozens of them, metal clinking against metal as he sorted through them. The scraping started again at my lock, and this time I recognized the sound. He was trying different keys, one after another, methodically working through what must have been a massive ring of them. I grabbed the biggest knife I had from my kitchen drawer, this old butcher knife my mom had given me when I moved out, and positioned myself behind the door. The operator kept telling me to stay calm, that officers were 3 minutes away now. but I could hear the lock mechanism clicking and turning as he found keys that partially fit. Through the peephole, I could see him crouched down, his face level with the doorknob, tongue poking out between his lips in concentration like a kid working on a difficult puzzle. His free hand was pressed flat against my door, and I noticed his fingernails were way too long, curved and yellowed, with dirt or something darker caked underneath them. Suddenly, Lily's voice rang out from her apartment. "I've got my gun and I know how to use it. The cops are coming." That was pure bluff. Lily was a sociology PhD student from California who did yoga every morning and wouldn't hurt a fly, but the man didn't know that. He stood up abruptly, shoving the keys back in his pocket, and for a moment just stood there, swaying slightly like he was drunk or dizzy. Then he did something I'll never forget. He leaned close to my door and whispered, but loud enough for me to hear clearly, "I've been watching you for weeks, through your window when you change. I know you put your lamp on the left side of your bed. I know you sing in the shower every morning at 7:15. That birthmark on your shoulder blade? Shaped like a butterfly." My legs nearly gave out because everything he said was true. My apartment faced the back alley, 3rd floor, and I'd never thought anyone could see in. But there was a taller building across the way, mostly offices that I assumed were empty on weekends and evenings. The birthmark thing hit me the hardest. You couldn't see that unless I was wearing a tank top or less, which meant he'd been watching me in my most private moments. The operator was saying something, but I couldn't focus. Blood rushing in my ears so loud it drowned everything out. The man continued, his voice dropping even lower. "Your boyfriend doesn't stay over on weeknights. Your friend with the curly hair hasn't visited in 9 days. The package you got yesterday is still sitting by your door unopened. Amazon, right?" The blue tape gave it away. Before I could process any of this, the stairwell door slammed open, and I heard police radios crackling, heavy boots running down the hallway. The man outside my door didn't run immediately, though. He stood perfectly still for maybe 3 seconds, then bent down one more time to the gap under my door. This time, he slid something underneath. A Polaroid photograph. Then he sprinted toward the opposite end of the hallway, where the other stairwell was, his footsteps echoing like gunshots. I heard the officers shouting, heard them pursuing him, their radios going crazy with updates and coordinates. I didn't move to pick up the photo right away, just stood there gripping the knife, waiting until an officer knocked and identified himself, showing his badge through the peephole. When I finally opened the door, my legs were shaking so bad, I had to lean against the wall. The officer, a young guy who looked like he could have been in one of my classes, asked if I was hurt, but I just pointed at the Polaroid on the floor. We both looked down at it, and I felt bile rise in my throat. The photo showed me sleeping in my bed, taken from inside my apartment. The angle was from the foot of my bed, like someone had been standing right there in my room while I slept. The timestamp on the bottom corner was from 2 nights ago, when Thomas had been at his night shift, and I'd gone to bed early with a headache. In the photo, my blanket was pulled down to my waist, and someone had drawn little red hearts around my face with what looked like lipstick or marker. The officer immediately called for backup to search my apartment, and within minutes, they found how he'd been getting in. The maintenance closet in the hallway had an access panel that connected to the ventilation system, and one of the grates in my bedroom ceiling had been carefully unscrewed and replaced multiple times, judging by the scratches on the screws. They found more Polaroids in that maintenance closet, dozens of them, not just of me, but of Lily, of the girl who lived in 3C, even some of Mrs. Chen from the 1st floor. Pictures of us doing normal things, cooking, watching TV, studying, sleeping. All taken from inside our apartments. The closet also had a makeshift bed, empty food containers, and a notebook filled with our schedules, habits, and personal details written in that same shaky handwriting from the note he'd shown me. They caught him 3 blocks away, trying to jimmy open a window to another apartment building. Turned out his name was Gordon Briggs, a former maintenance worker who'd been fired from a building management company 8 months earlier for inappropriate behavior toward female tenants. He'd kept copies of master keys from dozens of buildings he'd worked in over the years, and had been living in maintenance rooms and vacant apartments across the city, watching women through vents and gaps in the infrastructure that nobody ever thinks about. The police found his main stash in an abandoned unit in a building 6 blocks from mine. Hundreds more photos, pieces of mail he'd stolen, even some clothing items. I had to identify a sweater I thought I'd lost at the laundromat. The detective told me Gordon had been escalating, that the fake maintenance visits were new behavior, more aggressive than his previous stalking. I moved out that same week, stayed with Thomas until I found a new place with better security and no maintenance closets near the units. Lily moved too, and so did the girl from 3C. The building management company paid for our moving expenses and tried to keep it quiet, but word got out anyway. Last I heard, the building was half empty and up for sale. I still check my ceiling vents in every new place I live, still feel my chest tighten when someone knocks on my door unexpectedly, and I never, ever open the door for maintenance without calling the building manager first to verify. Last winter was when everything started getting weird at my duplex in Albany. I was 23, fresh out of college, working nights at a warehouse just to make rent on this cramped place I'd found through Craigslist. The building was old, probably from the 1940s, with those thin walls where you could hear everything. Footsteps, conversations, even someone brushing their teeth next door. My neighbor, Walter, was this quiet guy in his 50s who worked some kind of office job downtown. We'd exchange maybe 3 words a month in the shared laundry room downstairs, usually just him asking if the dryer was free, while adjusting his thick-rimmed glasses that always seemed to have fingerprint smudges on them. The first time I noticed my door unlocked, I figured I'd just been exhausted from my shift and forgotten to turn the deadbolt properly. You know how your brain plays tricks when you're running on 4 hours of sleep and gas station coffee. But then it happened again 3 days later. Came home around 7 in the morning after a particularly brutal night unloading trucks, and the door pushed open without me even using my key. Nothing was missing, nothing moved, just that sick feeling in my gut that someone had been in my space. Started taking pictures of how I left things. The angle of my coffee mug on the counter, the way my shoes lined up by the door, even the position of my TV remote on the couch arm. For about 2 weeks, nothing else happened. I'd almost convinced myself I was being paranoid. Maybe the lock was just worn out. Maybe the door frame had warped from the cold. Then came that Thursday night. I'd called in sick to work because I'd been throwing up all day, probably from some sketchy Chinese takeout I'd grabbed the night before. Around 9:30, I was lying on my couch watching some mindless reality show when I heard it. The distinct sound of my refrigerator door opening. Not the hum of it running, but that specific suction sound when the seal breaks. I muted the TV immediately, and there it was again, the clink of glass bottles shifting in the door shelf. Walter was in my kitchen. I could see his silhouette from where I was lying, illuminated by the fridge light. He was wearing what looked like pajama pants and a faded blue t-shirt with some kind of company logo on it. The strangest part was how casual he seemed, like he belonged there, carefully moving things around to reach something in the back. I sat up slowly, and he must have sensed the movement because he turned around, still holding my jar of strawberry jam. "Oh, hey there," he said, his voice steady and pleasant, like we'd bumped into each other at the grocery store. "Didn't think you'd be home tonight. Found your spare key in the laundry room last week. Figured we're neighbors, shouldn't be a big deal if I grabbed some sugar for my coffee." The thing is, I'd never had a spare key. Never made one. Never hid one anywhere. My landlord had one copy, and that was it. But Walter was standing there, holding my jam, waiting for an answer with this expression that wasn't quite a smile, but wasn't neutral either. Like his face was stuck between 2 emotions. I told him there was no spare key, that he needed to leave right now. He set the jam down on my counter, really gently, and pulled out a brass key from his pocket. "This one," he said, holding it up to the light. "Found it magnetized under the washing machine. Has your apartment number scratched right into it, see?" He stepped closer to show me, and I could smell his breath. coffee and something medicinal, like cough syrup. I backed up toward my phone on the coffee table. Told him again to get out or I'd call the cops. Walter didn't move though. He just stood there in my kitchen doorway, tapping that key against his palm in this slow rhythm. You work nights at the distribution center on Route 41, right? Must be exhausting. All alone here during the day, nobody checking on you. His voice stayed conversational, but the words made my skin prickle. I've been meaning to return this key, honestly. Just kept forgetting. But since I'm here, mind if I get that sugar? I already started making my coffee next door and it's getting cold. The way he said it, like we were having a normal conversation about borrowing ingredients, while standing in my apartment at night, it was like talking to someone whose reality operated on different rules. I grabbed my phone and started dialing 911, but Walter just sighed like I was being unreasonable. There's no need for that, he said, finally moving toward my front door. I'll get my sugar another time, but you should really be more careful about where you leave your keys. Found this one so easily. Imagine if someone dangerous had picked it up instead. He opened my door using that brass key from the outside lock, proving it actually worked. Before leaving, he paused and looked back at me. You should try sleeping during normal hours sometime. All that night work, irregular schedule, it's not healthy. I can hear you moving around at odd times through the walls, pacing, talking to yourself. The walls are thin, remember? Then he left, closing the door quietly behind him. I called my landlord immediately, even though it was late. He sounded annoyed but confirmed he'd only ever made one spare key, which he still had in his office safe. When I insisted someone had copied my key, he said it was impossible. The locks were some special brand that required authorization from the manufacturer to duplicate. I changed the lock myself that night, went to the 24-hour hardware store and bought the most expensive deadbolt they had. Installed it right there at 2 in the morning, with YouTube tutorials playing on my phone. The old lock looked normal when I removed it. No scratches or signs of tampering. But I threw it in the dumpster outside anyway, along with that brass key Walter had left on my kitchen counter. 3 days passed without incident. I'd started sleeping with a baseball bat next to my bed and installed one of those doorstop alarms from Amazon. Then Monday came. I got home from my shift around 6:40 in the morning, exhausted from loading boxes all night. The new lock was still engaged. The doorstop alarm hadn't been triggered. Everything seemed fine. I made myself some instant oatmeal and crashed hard, not even bothering to shower. Woke up around 3 in the afternoon to the sound of my shower running. Not dripping, fully running like someone was in there. I grabbed the bat and crept toward the bathroom. The door was slightly open, steam seeping out into the hallway. Through the gap, I could see a figure behind my shower curtain, just standing there under the water, not moving at all. I kicked the door open and yanked the curtain back. It was Walter, fully clothed in khakis and a button-down shirt, just standing under the hot water with his eyes closed. When he opened them, he didn't even look surprised. "The water pressure is better in your unit," he said matter-of-factly, water streaming down his face. "Mine barely gets warm anymore. Landlord won't fix it." He stepped out of the shower, his clothes making wet squelching sounds against the tile. "How did you get in here?" I demanded, still gripping the bat. He reached into his soaked pocket and pulled out another key, this one silver and newer looking. "You really should check your ceiling tiles," he said. "The one above your bathroom, it's loose. Connects right to my bathroom through the crawl space. Been meaning to tell the landlord about that too." That's when I lost it. Started yelling at him to get out, waving the bat around. Walter just walked past me, dripping water all over my floor, and sat down on my couch like nothing was wrong. The wet fabric made this horrible squishing sound as he settled in. "You need to calm down," he said, wringing out his shirt sleeve onto my carpet. "We're neighbors. Neighbors help each other. I water your plant when you're at work, that spider plant by the window. You never water it enough. I make sure your mail doesn't pile up. I even killed those mice in your walls last month. You didn't even know you had mice, did you?" He was right. I hadn't known about any mice. But now I was thinking about all those times I'd come home to find things slightly different. My plant looking healthier, mail stacked differently, that faint smell of men's cologne I'd attributed to imagination. I told him I was calling the police right now, no more warnings. Finally, something shifted in his expression. He stood up from my soaked couch and walked to the door, leaving wet footprints across my floor. "Fine," he said, his voice different now, colder, flatter. "But when your pipes freeze this winter, when your power goes out during storms, when you need someone to check if you're still breathing after not coming home for days, don't expect help. I know you don't have family here. I know you don't have friends. I was just trying to look out for you." He left through the front door this time, using yet another key I didn't know existed. I called the police, filed a report, but they said without proof of forced entry or stolen items, it was a civil matter. The landlord finally agreed to change the locks after I threatened to break my lease, but Walter had already moved out by then, disappeared overnight, leaving his apartment completely empty. I moved out 2 weeks later, stayed with a co-worker until I found a new place across town, a studio apartment on the 3rd floor with security cameras in the hallways and a doorman who worked nights. Never found out how Walter made those keys or why he'd chosen me to fixate on. The landlord swore he'd never given Walter access to anything, and the key manufacturer said their records showed no duplicates were ever ordered. Sometimes I wonder if he's doing the same thing to someone else now, standing in their shower, sitting on their couch, living these parallel, invasive moments in strangers' homes. I triple-check my locks every night, installed cameras inside my apartment, and I never, ever talk to my neighbors anymore. The other day I found a spider plant at my door with no note. I threw it straight in the garbage and spent the next 3 hours checking every corner of my apartment, every ceiling tile, every possible space where someone could hide a key. I'd been living in that small rental house for about 8 months, just me and my 6-year-old son, Caleb. It sat at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac in a suburb where nothing much happened. At least that's what I told myself when I signed the lease. My routine was predictable. Work, pick up Caleb from after-school care, dinner, homework, then bedtime around 8. That night, everything felt calm. The air was still. The street was quiet. And from my kitchen window I could see the faint glow of other houses settling into their own nightly routines. I had just finished reading Caleb his usual 2 bedtime stories when I heard the click from the backyard motion light. That sharp electrical pop the fixture makes when it flicks on was distinct enough that I paused mid-sentence. I brushed it off at first, probably a raccoon nosing around the trash bin, I thought, and went back to tucking the blanket around him. But the yard was fenced, and the bin was latched. Still, I didn't want him picking up on my hesitation, so I gave him a goodnight kiss and stepped quietly into the hallway. From the living room, I peeked through the blinds just enough to see the backyard. The bright cone of light illuminated the patchy grass and the worn wooden fence, casting sharp shadows from the lawn chairs I'd never gotten around to using. Nothing moved. The air was perfectly still. No wind to sway the tree branches, no flutter of leaves. I waited, holding my breath without realizing it, until the light clicked off again. Probably a bug, I told myself, though the thought didn't quite stick. I went back to the kitchen to clean up, but before I'd finished rinsing the plates, the motion light clicked on again. This time I moved faster, padding to the window with the blinds barely parted. The yard looked exactly the same as before. Still, silent, empty. It was just strange enough that a thin unease started creeping up the back of my neck. I told myself I'd ignore it unless it happened again. But less than 5 minutes later, the click came a 3rd time, and when I looked out, someone was standing just beyond the reach of the light, unmoving, facing directly toward my house. The figure stood just past the bright edge like it knew exactly where the sensor stopped seeing. The fence boards came up to his shoulders, 5.5 feet to the top rail, so he was taller than me, maybe 6 foot or close. A hood covered most of the head, and what I could make out of the face was a flat darkness where features should have caught the light. No shifting weight, no fidgeting, not even the small movements people do without noticing. I killed the kitchen light to lose the glare on the glass and pressed my forehead to the cool pane, counting the seconds until the motion light timed out like it always did after a minute. The light blinked off. Darkness pressed in, thick and complete for 2 heartbeats. Then the click came again and the yard exploded white. Lawn chairs, hose reel, the crooked bird feeder my kid painted. You could read the brush strokes in that paint. The figure hadn't moved an inch. My back found the wall without me planning it, and I slid along the cabinets checking locks in muscle memory. Deadbolt on the back door, stick in the slider track, window latches down. A text went to my neighbor across the cul-de-sac. Aaron, are you awake? Someone's in my yard. 3 little dots bubbled, then disappeared. No reply. Caleb's voice floated down the hall, small and sleepy. He wanted water. Every instinct screamed at me to keep him in bed, but ignoring him would only make him come looking. I grabbed his cup, filled it at the sink without taking my eyes off the blinds, and met him at his bedroom door. "Buddy, stay in bed, I'm handling a grown-up thing," I whispered, keeping my voice steady. As I tucked the blanket again, a soft scrape, grit grinding under a shoe, carried from the side yard where the gravel path runs to the gate. The light cycled off, then on again, and when I returned to the window, the figure stood a single step closer to the house. Talking to the glass felt ridiculous, but silence felt worse. "You need to leave," I said, keeping my voice low and controlled. No response. The key fob for my car sat in the dish by the door. I hit the panic button. The horn erupted, headlights flashed. The whole quiet street echoed. The figure backed into the darkness, not hurried, just deliberate, and vanished beyond the sensor's reach. That was my line. I dialed 911 and gave the dispatcher, her name was Kara, my address, the layout of my yard, and a running description of what I'd seen. While we spoke, the side gate latch rattled once, a clean metal click like someone testing how much give it had. Kara told me to stay on the line, keep the doors locked, and move away from the windows. I herded Caleb into my bedroom and locked the door, pulling him onto the bed with me while I kept the phone pressed to my ear. The hum of the line and Kara's calm voice were the only things keeping my thoughts from spiraling. Every few seconds I'd catch a faint crunch outside. Gravel, grass, maybe the wooden deck boards flexing under weight. Kara said officers were on the way, maybe 5 minutes out. 5 minutes felt like an hour. I kept scanning the shadows beyond the curtains, half expecting that hooded shape to be inches from the glass when I looked. Then came the sound of the motion light again, that sharp, mechanical click. My bedroom window faced the opposite side of the yard, the part the light barely touched, but in the faint spillover glow I could make out the pale vertical lines of the fence. And there, between 2 slats, a dark shape filled the gap. Someone's face was pressed close enough that I could see the outline of a cheekbone, the curve of a jaw, not moving, just there. I whispered to Kara what I was seeing, and she told me not to engage, that the officers were seconds away now. The next thing I heard was the distant warble of a siren winding into the neighborhood. The figure at the fence disappeared, as if pulled backward by invisible hands. A few seconds later, the motion light went dark for the last time. The cruiser pulled up out front, its headlights sweeping across my living room. 2 officers checked the yard with flashlights, found the gate latch loose but unbroken, and confirmed there were no fresh footprints, at least none they could make out in the patchy grass and hard soil. They took my statement, gave me a case number, and promised extra patrols that week. After they left, I spent the rest of the night in Caleb's room, his small breathing steady against the pillow while I sat by the window watching the backyard. The light never came on again. I replaced it with a camera the next day, one with night vision and a motion alert to my phone. In the months since, it's never once triggered for a person. Still, every time I hear that electric click in the quiet of the night, even if it's just for a wandering cat, I remember that hooded figure standing right where the light stopped, and how they seemed to know exactly how far they could go, without being truly seen.